Are you the quantum mechanics?
Yes, we are the Quantum Mechanics, the paranormal podcast for the believers, the doubters, and everybody in between. Special thank you to our Patreons at patreon.com/TQM pod. Brilliant discussion this week about some of the photos that we published recently of the flying crafts and some of the maybe hidden messages in there. It's prompted me to do a further investigation with a German museum, and I'm hoping that they can speak English because I can't speak German. But if you'd like to join us, go to that address, patreon.com/TQM pod, and join us for extra early episodes about a week ahead of everybody else, ad-free, and discussion and free stuff that we're planning as we speak. We've just had a little, I would say, meeting about it. It was more a casual discussion because there's only two of us. You shouldn't really have a formal meeting. I'm not going to set an agenda.
Was that supposed to take minutes?
It did actually take minutes, yes.
Yeah, literally took minutes. Well, Ben, it's weird how sometimes we get fixated on themes, isn't it? I mean, you have this period of time where it kind of shapes what we work on and research.
Yes.
And as regular listeners will know, over the last few weeks, I guess my obsession has been focused on the relationship, often conflict, between science and those with paranormal beliefs and experiences.
Yes.
So in the episode I did the other week on maverick scientists, we looked at scientists who put forward theories that were outside the conventional view and ridiculed, even though those theories turned out to be correct.
Yes.
I said last week that I started reading a paper that tackled some of those themes.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
And you said it was quite long and quite involved.
Yes, there was 80 pages. I got to about page 3 or 4. But as often happens, Ben, on the podcast, it led me in a completely different direction. Well, not completely different, but in a different direction.
Yeah, this sort of research for this show is all about rabbit holes, isn't it?
Really is. And that's what I like about the academic papers, because you look at the references, and it was like, wow, this gets referenced quite a lot. I'll have a look at that before I read further. So it sent me in the direction of an author and scientist called Rupert Sheldrake.
Yes. He's I was going to say synonymous with the paranormal, but kind of like not in a bad way. I couldn't find synonymous sounds like sort of putting it down. But yes, that's a well-known name, isn't it?
Yes. Well, he's published a number of books on the process, history, and I guess the politics of science. And as you said, he often touches on the kind of topics that relate to this podcast.
And most importantly, he's got a pronounceable name.
Yeah, he has. Although, it's funny, the more I look at it, the more I want to mispronounce it. Maybe that's something to do with it. I realised I had heard of his work and I'd seen him quoted in various bits and pieces, but I'd actually never read any of his books. So I thought I'd dig into one. The book I'm going to be referring to today is his book called The Science Delusion, and I used the revised edition, which was published in 2020. I think it originally came out like 2012 or something like that, but the more up-to-date one I've used. As you'll see as we get into this episode, it has somewhat scratched my itch in terms of understanding that relationship with science and the paranormal. We've debated it a little bit, but I don't know, he's got a way of putting it in a much more logical way than I ever could. Should we start with a bit of background on him? So Rupert Sheldrake's background is quite impressive, I've got to say. He majored in biochemistry at Cambridge University, studied history and philosophy of science at Harvard after receiving a scholarship, returned to Cambridge carrying out a PhD project on the development of plants. He was elected as a research fellowship at Clara College, Cambridge, where he became Director of Studies in Cell Biology and Biochemistry, so teaching students. He had a number of research papers published that have been influential in our understanding of cancer and HIV. He's had over 90 papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, as well as publishing a number of successful books.
You know, just when you think, you know, you're lying in bed, you go, what have I done with my life? I think, you know, I've thought, I'm pretty okay, you know, I'm doing okay. And then you get an overachiever like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I suppose the world needs them, but...
Yeah, I mowed the lawn the other week.
Well, I was just going to say, I managed to get all the way from Suffolk to Oxfordshire without needing to stop for a week. Yeah. So that is another thing.
Yeah, it's you know, it's just different types of...
different skills.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about this book I'm going to feature is that Sheldrake, I guess like the maverick scientist we talked about the other week, he questions and challenges the norms and assumptions of science. And like those mavericks, often putting them at odds with the scientific establishment. You can see why I got distracted from the paper, because it's
Definitely.
like, oh, okay,
Definitely.
this is good. Now, to give you an idea of where he's coming from, I've got a quote from the book. He says, "I have spent all my adult life as a scientist, and I strongly believe in the importance of the scientific approach. Yet I've become increasingly convinced that the sciences have lost much of their vigour, vitality and curiosity. Dogmatic ideology, fear-based conformity and institutional inertia are inhibiting scientific creativity. With scientific colleagues, I have been struck over and over again by the contrast between public and private discussions. In public, scientists are very aware of the powerful taboos that restrict the range of permissible topics. In private, they are often much more adventurous."
So this is interesting because this has been a recurring theme from when you were talking about maverick scientists.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of institutional inertia, that basically, I guess, is referring to, well, the powers that be, a board here, a funding model here, might be broken if you say it. Whereas those people, I guess, they were unique in that they'd broken free of those and they sort of had maybe just one funder that they agreed and persuaded. So that's okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It's a really interesting point, but I like the idea of... It's not that all those scientists are discounting these things. It's like they're in private. They goes, yeah, that is interesting, but there's no way they can say it publicly, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, the structure of the book is set out to challenge some of the core assumptions that science regards as hard facts. I think in the book, it's like 10 chapters on 10 questions. I'm not going to cover them all because they don't all relate, and I got a bit bogged down when I was reading it as well. But to give you a flavour, he challenges assumptions like all matter is unconscious, it has no inner life or subjectivity or point of view. Even human consciousness is an illusion produced by the material activities of the brain. So he challenges that, which we'll talk about a little bit. And this what really got me going, Ben. There's a chapter that challenges the assumptions that unexplained phenomena like telepathy are an illusion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sort of makes sense because, I mean, when you think about it, for the CIA, and I know we've said this before, but it bears repeating, for them to have invested money in it, clever people at some level said, yeah, it's worth having a look at.
There's something that could be going on.
Yeah.
He says why he's questioning some of these assumptions. He states, together these beliefs make up the philosophy or ideology of materialism, whose central assumption is that everything is essentially material or physical, even minds. This belief system became dominant within science in the late 19th century and is now taken for granted. Many scientists are unaware that materialism is an assumption. They simply think of it as science, or a scientific view of reality, or a scientific worldview. They are not actually taught about it or given a chance to discuss it. They absorb it by a kind of intellectual osmosis. I am convinced that the sciences are being held back by assumptions that have been hardened into dogmas maintained by powerful taboos. These beliefs project a citadel of established science but act as a barrier against open-minded thinking.
That's quite a powerful statement. That's almost like a preface to a serious book.
Yeah. Funny you say that. Rupert Sheldrake goes into a lot of detail of why this is the case. I'm going to try and do a short summary of what I think are some of the main points. Now, he talks about the connection originally between science and the church, both financially and I guess through a little bit of fear. Remember, Galileo was convicted of heresy. In modern times, especially after the Second World War, there's been a strong connection between science and the state. And he backs this up with a really interesting statistic, that in 2015 in the US, the total expenditure on research and development was $495 billion. $121 billion of that came from the government. So that's a quarter of all research funding.
Does he point out whether that is like military or is it just across the board?
Yeah, across the board, but he doesn't break it down. But his major point is knowledge is power.
Right, yeah.
Another issue is the closed nature of science. He quotes a historian of science, George Sarton. Truth can be determined only by the judgment of experts. Everything is decided by a very small groups of men. In fact, by single experts whose results are carefully checked. However, by a few others. The people have nothing to say but simply to accept the decision handed out to them. Scientific activities are controlled by universities, academies and scientific societies, but such control is as far removed from popular control as it possibly could be. So again, it's this small group of people, and we've seen this in the past, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why that sort of feeling was, I guess, echoed in recent times when people have said experts, we don't need experts.
Yeah. And he highlights this process when he's talking about determinism. So basically the idea that free will is an illusion. He says, when a belief in determinism was applied to the activity of the human brain, it resulted in a denial of free will on the grounds that everything about the molecular and physical activities of the brain was in principle predictable. Yet this conviction rested not on scientific evidence, but simply on the assumption that everything was fully determined by mathematical laws.
Right, okay.
And this is the theme when you read the book. It's like, hey, you think this is a scientific fact. It's a view. Mm-hmm. It's an opinion, but it's now been accepted as a scientific fact, so you can't question it.
Yeah, and I guess the sort of the correct comeback to that would be yes, but lots and lots of people peer-reviewed it and agree. And that's why, but then I suppose what he's saying is you've got to look at the background of those peers. And because if you go too far, you end up talking about the flat earth. And so you do need guardrails on that sort of
that's
challenge.
Why they're there. Yes. Yeah. Well, again, from my reading, the book points out that, interestingly, quantum physics and quantum mechanics is challenging determinism, bringing in chance, probability, not certainty and predictability. So that's, it keeps referring back to quantum mechanics.
Right.
The next point touches on something we featured on the podcast before, that humans have almost a primeval need to believe they are right and understand everything. And this is highlighted by a number of quotes from prominent scientists across the ages. These are fantastic. So, in 1888, respected astronomer Simon Newcomb wrote, "We are probably nearing the limit of all we can know about astronomy."
Within his worldview, that's probably true.
Yeah. 1894, Nobel Prize winner for physics Albert Michelson. The most important fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered.
Oh. Yeah.
1900, William Thomson, also known as Lord Kelvin. There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurements. And even in 1997, John Horgan, who's a senior science writer at Scientific America, if one believes in science, one must accept the possibility, even the probability, that the great era of scientific discovery is over.
Ooh, in 1997, as the internet is coming forth and
AI,
that seems a bold, naive, and perhaps purposefully disruptive thing to say. Or perhaps he was just going to retire. I don't know, but gosh, okay.
Now, in terms of the predominant belief in the 21st century, the author believes we're in a period of materialism, so nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications.
Yeah, and I think, just to sort of, the subnote to that is why I believe so many UFO sightings are the nuts and bolts type.
Yes, exactly.
And we don't relate it to other things.
Yep.
Bigfoot must be a hidden hominid that is on the same evolutionary path branch as us, and ghosts must be dead people. What else could it possibly be?
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, it's demons. I get exactly what he's talking about.
And it reminded me a bit of what we talked about in that other episode about Marshall McLuhan and his rearview mirror. You know, that's the UFO phenomenon you're talking about. We need to understand it in a frame of reference that we understand.
Yeah.
I guess this brings us all back to this thought that there is no such thing as free will. So Sheldrake suggests many scientists question this assumption, but are reluctant to challenge it for fear of ridicule or being ostracised. He says, all over the world, scientists know that the doctrines of materialism are the rules of the game during working hours. Few professional scientists challenge them openly. I like this bit. At least before they retire or get a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, there we go, yeah.
He also has a pop at Ricky Gervais.
What?
Yeah, in the book. I was quite surprised with this came up.
What's he got to do with it?
Well, apparently Ricky Gervais did some interview when he was... I think he was... some magazine has said he's one of the top 100 most important people in the world. And Ricky Gervais was asked about science, and he says... I was going to do a Ricky Gervais voice, but I can't. He says, science seeks the truth, and it does not discriminate. For better or worse, it finds things out. Science is humble. It knows what it knows, and it knows what it doesn't know. Its basis is conclusions and belief on hard evidence that is consistently updated and upgraded. It doesn't get offended when new facts come along. It embraces the body of knowledge. It doesn't hold on to medieval practices because they are tradition.
Well, I suppose what I guess he might say is, well, that's true of science taken in its purest form, but you add in the fuzzy logic of the human into that, and that's where things, maybe deviate.
Yeah, he's a little bit more cutting.
Okay.
Gervais's idealised view of science is hopelessly naive.
Oh, right, okay.
In the context of history and the sociology of science. It portrays scientists as open-minded seekers of the truth, not ordinary people competing for funds and prestige, constrained by peer group pressures and hemmed in by prejudice and taboos. He does throw him a little bone. He said, yet naive as it is, I'd take his idea of free inquiry seriously.
Well, maybe you should be clear what the question is, because I'm getting a little bit, and that's,
Yeah, well... While I was reading this chapter, Ben, I kept thinking of the Mavericks we talked about the other week, and in particular, Alfred Wegener, who put forward the theory of continental drift. Continents were once joined, drifted apart, and he was ridiculed for this idea. And he fits into many of the themes that this author talks about, because he challenged an assumption that scientists of the day regarded as a hard fact. He wasn't a geologist, so was outside that small group of experts in the field that his theory related to and were peer reviewing each other's work.
He wasn't in the club.
Yeah, and he challenged those prejudices and taboos of the time. So it really struck me while reading that chapter of I just had Wegener's continental drift in my mind the whole time when I was looking at it. Other chapters in the book did touch on something you featured in the episode on quantum mechanics and time slips, that most scientists take it for granted that the laws of nature are fixed. But he says that looking at measurements for the speed of light, for example, show that we have to keep questioning assumptions. He says, early measurements of the speed of light varied considerably, but by 1927 the measurement values had converged to 299,796 kilometres per second. At that time, the leading authorities on the subject concluded the present value of C is entirely satisfactory and can be considered more or less permanently established. However, all around the world, from about 1928 to 1945, the speed of light dropped by about 20 kilometres a second.
Well, that's shrinkflation for you.
Yeah. The best value found by leading investigators were impressively close together, and they all agreed on this. Until the late 1940s, and the speed of light went up again by 20 kilometres a second. And a new consensus developed around that higher value. This is fantastic as well, the next two bits. In 1972, the embarrassing possibility of variations in c, the speed of light, was eliminated when the speed of light was fixed by definition. In addition, in 1983, the unit of distance, the metre, was redefined in terms of light. Therefore, if any further changes in the speed of light happened, we will be blind to them because the length of the metre will change with the speed of light.
Right, that's called fixing the outcome.
Yeah,
but
the problem.
It's interesting because what the author that I was discussing was sort of postulating, part of his argument was that the speed of light c had changed throughout time.
Not just the measurement, it was bigger than that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so he went on to elaborate on that, how time slips could happen. But he did say, at different points in the age of the universe, the c had different values.
Yeah.
But again, so this doctrine of it's fixed sort of removes the possibility of talking about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get on some really interesting paranormal stories and stuff in a minute that he features, but I just wanted to finish off by this bit. He comes back quite a lot to this theory of human consciousness and this belief really in modern science that it doesn't really exist. He says the central doctrine of materialism is that matter is the only reality. Therefore, consciousness ought not exist. Materialism's biggest problem is that consciousness does exist. You are conscious now. The main opposing theory, dualism, accepts the reality of consciousness, but has no convincing explanation for its interaction with the body and the brain. We come back to quantum mechanics to question that perceived wisdom and the work of Alfred North Whitehead, who developed a theory of relativity which was almost identical in its predictions as Einstein. So this was another scientist at the same time as Einstein, separately working. Whitehead was probably the first philosopher to recognise the radical implications of quantum physics. He realised that the wave theory of matter destroyed the old ideas of material bodies as essentially spatial, existing at points in time, but without any time within them. He thought of the physical world as made up of not material objects, but actual entities or events. And that was quite complicated, but I put it in there because it made me think, you said something the other week, we've been talking about waves a lot recently.
Yeah.
And it made me think as well about time slips or even encounters with ghosts, this kind of connection of a wave between the past, the future. Because, arguably, I think a lot of scientists say the present doesn't really exist. It's either past or future.
Yes. And that is exactly really what the argument about time slips was. It was that wave going backwards.
Yeah. Well, let's get into what we would call more kind of paranormal stuff. There is an amazing chapter that touches on collective consciousness passed down from generation to generation. Oh,
we covered that, didn't we? Those people, I can't remember where it was. There was an island.
Yes, it was Scotland, wasn't it?
Scotland, yes, yeah. And they have a particular ability to read minds, I think, something like this. But very specific pockets of inherited knowledge or abilities.
Yeah.
We've looked at that before, yes.
Well, he talks about one of the longest series of experiments in the history of psychology in which rats do seem to learn quicker what other rats have already learned. As generations go on, rats learn quicker each generation, and these experiments have been run all over the world, giving the same results. Now, Ben, you're probably thinking, this is genetic, right? Passed down through the genes of one generation to another. But an experiment at Melbourne University came up with a mind-boggling result. A line of controlled rats whose parents had never been trained showed the same pattern of improvements as rats descended from their trained parents.
Wow.
Nothing to do with genes, which implies the existence of some level of collective consciousness.
So a rat knows something, therefore other rats will be able to know it faster or easier.
Yes. And there are some, I won't go into the details of the experiments, but there were a couple of experimental examples he used with humans. They weren't quite as clear-cut as the rat one, but Yes, by implication, I mean, that's just mind-boggling, isn't it? That these control rats who shouldn't know, they improve even though they don't share the genes with trained rats who know this stuff.
This is the thing of, like, in humans, the car is invented simultaneously in different places. The television, different inventions, they seem to come out of, like, not necessarily ether, but they come along at the same time. And the explanation is always, well, technology was moving that way anyway. But I always find that curious that Benz is inventing the car over here, and Mr. not Morris, but I can't remember his name, but someone else here down the road. Yeah.
We've got the same, haven't we, with the invention of the telephone, of light bulb, of I mean, even the one we were talking about earlier, Einstein and this other guy doing theories of relativity.
Yeah.
I guess there are, like you said, it's kind of zeitgeisty, is what you'd call it, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
But maybe there is more going on than we think there is. Something that is quote unquote paranormal. Should we get to the part of the book that deals with ESP and premonition?
I knew you were going to say that.
Let's start with the very human habit of staring at people or feeling like you're being stared at. Most people have felt someone looking at them from behind, turned round and met that person's eye. Most people have also experienced the converse. They've sometimes made people turn around by staring at them. And weirdly, I was talking to somebody about this the other day. He goes, I've had that happen all the time. I'm looking at someone and then they suddenly look at me.
Not just people. I would argue my dog as well.
We're coming on to pets.
Okay.
So in an extensive survey in Europe and North America, between 70 and 97% of adults and children reported experiences of these kinds. Now, the author himself did some research into this phenomena in Europe and the US. He discovered that when people reported they felt like they were being stared at from behind, it was more prominent when they were in the street or bars, and happened more when people felt vulnerable, which does suggest, Ben, that it might have some primitive purpose, which he does get onto. The author reports that this phenomenon is well known by surveillance officers and apparently works even when you're being watched through binoculars.
No. What, so there's a sort of a, don't look at them too long, otherwise they'll know?
Well, he says several soldiers have told him that people could tell when they were being looked at through telescope sights, such as the report from a soldier from the US Marine Corps who was a sniper in Bosnia in 1995. While aiming through a telescope sight of his rifle, he found that people seemed to know when he was aiming at them. He says, within 1 second prior to actual termination, a target would somehow seem to make eye contact with me. I am convinced that these people somehow sensed my presence at a distance of over 1 mile. They did so with uncanny accuracy, in effect, to stare down my own scope.
That's crazy. I've never heard that before.
And there was also reports by paparazzi photographers taking pictures of celebrities with long-distance lenses that are similar as well. Many of them reporting that their celebrity target would often turn round and stare at them directly right down the lens. One photographer told the author, I am taking pictures at distances of up to half a mile away in situations where it's quite impossible for people to see me, although I can see them. They are so aware it's uncanny.
Wow. Okay, that does blow my mind.
Now, many report the same phenomena in connection with their pets, as you were alluding to. Some claiming their dogs and cats can wake them just by staring at them.
Yes, absolutely they can. Absolutely.
And as to why, Sheldrake says, which I think is a really amazing point, if the sense of being stared at is real, then it must have been subject to evolution by natural selection. How might have it evolved? The most obvious possibility is in the context of the predator-prey relationship. Prey animals that detect when predators were looking at them would stand a better chance of surviving than those that did not.
Yeah, and less chance of having your dog wee on the bedroom carpet if it can wake you by staring at you. But that has happened. Like, as you know, my new dog, he has woken me at least 2 times that I can remember, and he's just been staring at me like 4 o'clock in the morning. I've been fast asleep, And I've gone, what's wrong? And I've turned the light on, and there he is, staring at me, his tail going slowly.
Yeah.
And you just know that means, right, I need a wee, but he didn't know how to wake me up. But he did know how to wake me up.
Because you woke up. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, all this seems a bit anecdotal, but there have been tests and research into this ability. Weirdly, there was an initiative between New Scientist magazine, the BBC and Discovery Channel, who got students at schools and universities to try the simple test of predicting if someone was staring at them from behind. Tens of thousands of trials were conducted, and the results were remarkably consistent. 55% of participants correctly identified when they were being stared at, compared to 50% by chance. So it's not huge, but there is a difference, and it's consistent.
Yeah.
Similar lab tests have been conducted, this is mad as well, with subjects being watched or not watched via CCTV. The subjects were wired up to skin response equipment, measuring sweat and stress. The subject's skin resistance changed significantly when they were being looked at, unbeknown to them, via CCTV.
That really is crazy.
That's mad, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that sort of uncanny feeling that something's not right, someone's looking at me. And I always put that down to, like, just paranoia around the street or something. But I have been, I don't know, like, I've stayed in hotels where I feel very uncomfortable in places, and I've imagined it, but I'm not sure I was being observed. But I understand, I suppose what I'm trying to say is I understand what that feeling feels like.
Yeah. Well, I'd be really interested if any of the listeners out there have ever had that experience of feeling that someone was looking at them who they couldn't see, turning round and going, yeah, they were, or vice versa, they've stared at somebody who's then turned around to catch their eye. Because it seems, I've mentioned it to a couple of people, and everybody seems to relate to it on some level. Shall we move on to Chapter 9, Ben? And I'll tell you why I'm excited by Chapter 9. Are psychic phenomena illusory? Let's start with the intro to the chapter, because I thought it was really good. Most materialist dogmas go almost unquestioned, but the claim that psychic phenomena are illusory is inevitably controversial. Most people have had seemingly telepathic or precognitive experiences. Most have felt that they were being looked at from behind and have turned around, or they've made others turn by staring at them. Many pet owners have noticed that their dogs and cats seem to pick up their intentions even when they are out of sight. Such occurrences are sometimes called intuitive or psychic or parapsychology, or are attributed to 6 or 7 senses, to an extrasensory perception, ESP. For a committed materialist, all such phenomena are illusory. Minds are inside the brains, and mental activity is nothing but electrochemical brain activity. Hence, thoughts and intentions cannot have direct effects at a distance. Neither can minds be opened to the influences of the future. Although such paranormal phenomena seems to occur, they must have normal explanations in terms of coincidence, or subtle sensory cues, or wishful thinking, or fraud. So that's the science group view. But the author disagrees, Ben, as you can probably imagine.
Yeah, definitely.
What I thought was really interesting, he also questioned the use of language, such as the term paranormal. He says, psychic phenomena are normal in the sense that they are common. For example, most people have had a seemingly telepathic experience with telephone calls. But because these experiences do not fit in with the materialist mind in brain theory, they are classified as paranormal, literally meaning beyond the normal. In this sense, normal is defined not by what actually happens, but by the assumptions of materialists. That's a great point, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I think we felt that, and always, like, you don't want to, we want to walk that middle line because we want to sort of appreciate both sides of the point of view, and I can understand why some scientists would have a real problem with that, but I guess he's going to present some evidence as to why he doesn't believe that.
Yeah, there's some amazing stuff coming up. He also says the term parapsychology means beyond psychology, and implies that it's not part of normal psychology. He says, I think this term is unfortunate, and I prefer the older term of psychic research or PSI research for short. If PSI phenomena exists, which I think it does, they are normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural.
I would agree with that because, I mean, it's only, we use the word para because we sort of, it's like there is no explanation. But if there is an implied explanation, then it just becomes part of that field, yes.
And he says they are part of human nature and animal nature, and they can be investigated scientifically. So let's come on to that. Before I come on to that, actually, there's a really interesting anecdote in the book, which I took as it was a seminal moment for Rupert Sheldrake in changing his mind about the paranormal. He said that him and some other students were being dismissive about the idea of telepathy. And a former professor of biology at Oxford University, Sir Rudolph Peters, overheard their conversation. He butted in and said, have any of you ever looked at the evidence? Which I thought was great. And Sir Peter then gave them details of a paper he had published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research.
Oh, nice.
So this paper that changed his mind included a study by a ophthalmologist. I thought I was going to struggle with that, but I got it out. Disorders of the eyes for me and you, Ben. The ophthalmologist had a boy patient who was severely disabled and blind, yet in routine eye tests, he was able to read the letters on the tests very well. Now, the ophthalmologist realised the boy only had the ability to name the letters when his mother was looking at them.
Oh, my goodness.
They conducted more experiments at the family home, separating the boy and mother to avoid any trickery or subconscious cueing that might be going on. When the mother was shown letters and numbers, the boy identified them in a separate room with a much higher hit rate than could have been done through chance. They then upped the ante, Ben. They separated the two of them in laboratories 6 miles apart, so lab conditions. In the way they devised the trial, there was a 4% chance of guessing the letters. This will blow your mind. The boy managed to match the letters 38% of the time.
Wow, that's, well, that speaks for itself. That is crazy.
The odds are 1 billion to 1.
1 billion?
Yeah. The author studied other research into telepathy and came up with some interesting data. The people, this is amazing as well, and I never really thought about it, but it does make sense. The people who are related or friends performed much better than two strangers taking these scientific tests.
Wow.
And that made me think, Ben, about our experience of remote viewing when we set each other the tests. Mm-hmm. Now, full disclosure, when we did the ESP card tests, we did terribly badly.
Terribly.
Lower than by chance, I think we calculated.
That's right.
But the remote viewing target we set each other, which was the one we really tried to telepathically transmit to each other, gave us much better results. Yours was better than mine, but I think I still got key aspects of the target you set me. And I do wonder if there's because of our friendship link.
Yes.
It's really interesting that, isn't it?
Yeah, because Tim did quite well as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've known Tim for 39 years, so yeah.
The book also goes into a number of studies that we have featured on the podcast before. I think it was in the episode we did on Dream ESP, so you might want to check that out if you're listening, and there's more detail. But the post-it note summary is nearly all of these trials results are higher than could be achieved by pure chance alone.
I'm just frustrated that nobody pays any attention to this, because I mean that is obviously people like Daz Smith. They know this, because they experience it. They do it for a living. They know it.
Yeah.
But it's so. Yes, the community is so dismissive, and the community just when I say the scientific community, that just represents pretty much everyone I bump into. I mean, most people who I would speak to in the pub would just say, "Oh well, it's chance," or But you can prove it's not.
To put the other side of it, there was one of the studies which he talks about in the book, which I think I covered before, and there was some debate about whether fingerprints had been put on the photos because they were the ones that chose, so either consciously or subconsciously. So a lot of these tests, they're there is a counter view, but I think your point is valid. That counter view then seems to negate all of this research, doesn't it? Whereas, if we were truly being scientific about it, we'd continue developing the tests and get more scientific.
Refine the experiment, yeah.
Yeah. The book then moves on to ESP and animals, including a book he mentions a book quite a lot by William Long called How Animals Talk, which was published in 1919. This includes studies involving wild wolves in Canada who managed to respond to each other's activities at many miles away. And I don't know how they did this, but apparently they ruled out scent, hearing and other sounds. That study motivated Sheldrake to conduct his own research into domestic animals and something akin to dogs and cats displaying kind of Vardiga type abilities, knowing when their owners are coming home. He says, I appealed through the media for people to tell me about their experiences with dogs and cats that anticipated arrivals and soon received dozens of reports. By 2019 on my database, I had more than 1,200 accounts of dogs and more than 670 of cats that anticipated their owners' returns. Many of these stories made it clear that the animals' responses were not simply reactions to sounds of the familiar car or familiar footsteps in the street. They happened too long in advance, and they also happened when people came home by bus or train. Nor was it a matter of routine. Some people worked irregular hours, like plumbers, lawyers or taxi drivers, and yet those at home knew when they were coming because the dog or cat waited at the door or window, sometimes half an hour or more before that person arrived. That's very common, right?
Yes, it's very common. I've witnessed this, yes.
He says more than 20 other species showed similar anticipatory behaviour, especially parrots and horses. Also a ferret. He's got cases of several bottle-fed lambs raised as pets and one pet goose.
Pet goose.
He said, in a random household telephone survey in Britain and the United States, I found that in about 50% of dog-owning households and 30% of cat-owning households, these animals were said to anticipate the arrival of a family member.
Yeah. And it is so common that we don't even think it's unusual.
No.
I mean, my mum's dog... My mum did work at irregular hours, and my mum's dog would get down. He had a particular place where he would sit, and he would go and move closer to the door, and then maybe 20 minutes later she'd come home, and you could set your watch by. My gran would always. I remember her saying, "Oh, your mother will be on her way home because the dog moves," and nobody thinks that's weird.
Yeah, I don't get it with my dog. I mean, he's quite neurotic. If any pigeon sets foot on his garden, he just goes absolutely nuts. So we'd never be able to pin it down. He also has 198 accounts of dogs and 119 of cats responding to death or distress, sometimes when they are not even at the same location. We did cover that before in Paranormal Pooches. But, Ben, wow. His most impressive story involves an African grey parrot called Nakisi, who had a vocabulary of around 1,500 words. Like, that's just nuts, isn't it?
I know people with less than that.
Yeah, really. The parrot's owner, Amy Morgana, noticed the bird seemed to read her thoughts and would say them aloud and say what she was thinking, even waking the owner up out of her sleep and describing her dreams.
No.
Again,
that's crazy.
That's nuts, isn't it? And again, in this case, controlled experiments took place, and the parrot did indeed have a highly significant statistical hit rate compared to chance.
That would scare me. Some of my dreams, I don't want anyone else to know.
Yeah, can you imagine? Yeah.
Especially the one with Holy Valance, but we'll keep that out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine, can't you? The author also details studies into phenomena I think all of us can relate to. Thinking about a friend or loved one, and then by chance they ring you. In a controlled test, a subject would be called at random times by one of 4 close friends. The subject needed to say who was calling before picking up the phone. Now, by chance, the hit rate should have been 25%, but in fact, the subjects correctly predicted 45% of the time.
That's impressive.
The experiment is repeated with similar results in other studies, so it wasn't just a one-off. It's been done a number of times. What I like, Ben, is Sheldrake then took the basis of those studies to test his theory about telepathy being stronger between relatives and friends. He explains, in some of our tests, there were 2 familiar callers and 2 unfamiliar callers, whom the subjects had never met but whose names they knew. The hit rate with unfamiliar callers was nearly at chance level. With the familiar callers, it was 52%, about twice the level of chance.
That's interesting. And I guess he designed the experiment properly so to eliminate it. But I suppose I always sort of think, Mum's going to phone soon, but that's because I know when Mum would phone. Yeah. But he said it would be random time.
Yeah.
But
so he I think it was scheduled. They were scheduled calls from his end. So yes, you would know your parents were, or your mum was going to call because if they were one of the 4, but you wouldn't know when.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, it seemed to support his idea that telepathy occurs more between people who are bonded to each other than like between strangers.
He should have got that parrot to phone someone.
Yeah.
That would have been good. I know what you're dreaming. That's just sinister, isn't it?
It really is.
And I suppose that would make sense because besides human relationships, there's probably no strong relationship between. Well, I could speak on behalf of me. No strong relationship between me and my dog. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Well, I must say, Ben, Rupert Sheldrake does have his critics, including someone we've mentioned on the podcast before, Richard Wiseman. He's not a fan.
Oh yeah, he would do. Yeah.
I'm going to use a quote from science writer Sam Wolfe when he was reviewing the book that I've been talking about today. He says, "The problem with Robert Sheldrake, however, is that his ideas do not really survive critical investigation, and so they remain within the realms of pseudoscience. His book, The Science Delusion, that many celebrate as an attack on dogmatism in science, instead involves a distortion of how science actually operates."
Yeah.
Now, I guess you can make up your own mind of, is this like the quotes of people, dispelling a maverick or,
Yeah. Just to say it straight, this is not against Richard Wiseman at all, but Richard Wiseman's career is built around saying things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised.
That wasn't his quote, but yes. Yeah,
right, okay.
But he has been equally critical of him. What was interesting, I can't remember who it was. He was asked to be on, this author was asked to be on some TV show and said, "I'll come as long as we debate it from a factual and scientific point of view." And as it was a pre-record, and as soon as he started going into his science, they said, "Oh, we don't want to cover any of that." It was like,
yeah.
Well, whether he's right or wrong, for me, the book made me ask questions of my own assumptions, which I guess was his point, really, about all that with science. Don't assume something is a fact. Question. Did give me a different perspective on the attitude of many scientists when it comes to paranormal investigations. But I think the key thing for me was I really like that idea of it's normal. It's not paranormal. We should start thinking about it in that way. I'm going to leave the last word to the author.
Not the parrot.
Not the parrot. Holly.
Don't put that there.
He says, "The realisation that the sciences do not have the fundamental answers leads to humility rather than arrogance, an openness rather than dogmatism. Much remains to be discovered and rediscovered, including wisdom."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the key, is the whole problem is if anyone starts dismissing anybody out of hand rather than discussing it, that's when we run into the problems of, well, we can't, we will never get to the bottom of it unless we have that proper conversation. And I think we must have said that 100 times on this show. Well, it's interesting because I didn't know what you were going to do as a topic today. And I was thinking to myself as I was driving back, so I just told you I was just come back from Suffolk, and this time of year, if you don't know Suffolk. The lanes, the roads are very small, narrow, around the villages, and the grass verges are grown. So you have to drive along particularly slowly, and more so during the day because you can't see the lights of a car coming the other way. And I've been driving for 30 odd years, and I know how to drive on those roads. But I do feel very strongly that part of that driving is done with ESP, because I sort of know, and I'm right 9 times out of 10, there's going to be something coming around this bend. And sometimes I know it's going to be too big for me to get past. I'm going to have to find a pull-in space, or it's going too fast. It happened to me yesterday as I was going around a tight bend. I thought, it's going to be a van coming around the other way. And there was, and he was going too fast. And it was a split-second thing, and I smiled to myself when I knew that was going to happen. Yeah. And I didn't say it to anybody, and I feel like part of driving is that. I'd be interested if anybody else has that experience.
Yeah, it does. Again, in the book, I can't remember exactly what he says, but he does touch on driving, not in that context. But, there is that kind of subconsciousness about it, subconscious competence that you get through driving. And I think he was making an analogy of it. This could be the type of thing that he was talking about with, the staring stuff. There is some... Yeah. Again, there is an advantage for you knowing there's danger coming round the bend that you can't see coming.
And if part of driving is that, then autonomous cars are always going to be more dangerous because they can't...
Yeah, they don't have that.
They don't have that sort of ESP level. And of course, I'm never going to be able to...
Or do they?
Oh, God, I'm never going to be able to prove it, but it's just a feeling that... People are just going to say, well, yes, that's sort of your imagination, and that's a way of you saying you were just being particularly careful at that particular juncture, at that point, but I don't know.
I guess people would say you probably don't remember the 5 times that you did it before, when no one came round.
That's right, because I would have gone around there slowly anyway, but I just had a very strong feeling that something was definitely coming the other way. Either way... Probably something to discuss down at the Horse and Parrot. I think you mentioned Horse and Parrot. I just think that's a great name for a pub.
It is, yeah.
There's a one not too far away from us called the Horse and Radish, which is a very good name.
Yeah.
But the Horse and Parrot, I like it.
Yeah. Well, the book we featured today is The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake. We really only touched the surface of it today, so it's well worth checking it out. In the UK, it's on Amazon paperback for around £9. Kindle version's about $4.99. So yeah, check it out. There's some other stuff that other books of his, so I'm sure I'm going to be reading more, and we might feature him again.
Definitely. And if you haven't come across Rupert Sheldrake before, just have a look on YouTube. There's a few videos of his. Have a watch, see what you make of him. I'm fascinated, and I really like the fact that he's that overachiever who thinks differently.
Yeah, again, it's just maybe that's why I was thinking of Wegener and that episode I did on Maverick Scientists as well. It's like, well, he feels like one of those people, and he might not be right about everything, and maybe some of the experiments are flawed, but it doesn't mean you can rule out everything. It just means there's further investigation needed, and kind of that's what he's saying,
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was great. I'm off to stare at some people and see if I can get them to turn round.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to muzzle my parrot.
Definitely do that. I've never heard it called that before.
Yeah.
Join us at patreon.com/TQM pod. Interact with us on the social medias. Very kindly, if you do leave us notes on the Podbean platform, it's very difficult for us to reply to you for some reason, which is why I sometimes pick up and reply to you on Patreon, or if I know who you are on social. But don't stop doing it. I'm just saying, if you do leave us a note and you're offended we didn't get back to you, that's just the way it is. And if I can't find you other ways, I'm sorry. But
I would say the same. I've had a similar thing on Spotify as well. People have responded or asked us questions on Spotify, and I'm sure it's user error rather than their platform, but I can't work out how to get back to you. So a similar thing. We're not ignoring you or being rude. It's just incompetence rather than...
We have a combined age that would take you back to sort of before manned flight, so just bear with us.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, well, we will be back next week with more quantum mechanics weirdness, and we'll see you then.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you the quantum mechanics?